Hello and welcome to No Easy Answers with Jules Taylor, the show where we unpack and examine our lives, our politics, and society. These conversations are meant to create meaningful distinctions, refine our understanding of the world around us, and maybe, if we're lucky, accomplish a small amount of the work that I'm told takes years of therapy. So welcome to the show, our second episode. All my guys, gals, and non-binary pals, I'm your friend, ally, accomplice, and I'm your host, Jules Taylor. So the last time we were here, we spoke about something that I was just calling the notion. And just as a quick recap of what we discussed and what we'll pick up on today, so the notion was like it's a series of three sentences. I refer to them as like tenets of this sort of collective thing I'm referring to as the notion, right? And they're kind of heavy sentences, but check it out. So the notion is, and what I'll just keep referring to as the notion, is that there is a right answer for every question. And there is a proven method that's reliable in order to arrive at the right answer for every question. And all of these right answers fit together in some sort of cosmic jigsaw puzzle. And so I examined that for a while and kind of sat with it and had some thoughts around it. And I suggested that the notion is some sort of expression of like an existential angst and a need for order, and that humans are order-making machines, meaning that we lead the crusade against uncleanliness, and we invented soap, and we attempt to make order out of our immediate lives by organizing all of our stuff, and then we seek that similar type of order in our external world. So we seek out trying to make sense of our political systems, our society, our, the geopolitics of international relations. We study race relations. We study gender theory, right? Maybe we crave this sort of order, or we need to know that things make sense in some way, even if they're chaotic, nonsensical, and filled with contradictions. So when we talked about the notion, I basically got around to a point where I said, I don't really agree with the notion, and maybe there's freedom in the chaos, right? Which is a sort of like an optimistic, nihilistic sort of take on things, I would think. But here's what I want to talk about today, and this was something I probably would have talked about anyway at some point, but since I received some feedback from the first show on like, hey, Jules, you're an atheist, right? Why do you spend so much time thinking about God, and why did you talk about God so much during your first show? Well, it's not so much God that I'm concerned with, man. I just don't think that there is an honest way to engage with philosophy, and especially moral theory, without taking into account theology. So what do I mean by moral theory? I mean that first of all, we define morality, right? The extent to which an action is right or wrong, a particular system of values and principles of conduct, especially one held by a specific person or society, principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong and good or bad behavior. So I tend to think of moral theory as like the process of analyzing the morality of a specific action or a specific outcome that every individual does. But I don't think there's a fair way to, in philosophy in general, I don't think there's a fair way to engage within moral theory without at least considering what theology has to say about it. And I also think whether or not you are religious, or you are non-practicing religious, or you are not religious at all, and maybe you're an atheist, right? You are a non-theist. You are a person that outright believes that there is no God, right? Well, you're not immune from Judeo-Christian, hegemony, we could call it, right? Like the sort of seeming sort of monopoly or dominance that religion has in the conversation about moral theory. So briefly here, man, I'm going to talk about moral theory, and I'd say briefly, we might spend the rest of this episode talking about moral theory. So strap in. Exciting philosophy conversation here about things that interest me and that other people are tired of hearing me talk about, right? But not you guys. You guys are here to talk about, here to listen to me talk about moral theory. All right, so check it out, man. Here's the moral theory pie chart, right? It's broken down into 4 equal slices. Of course, depending on who you are, you might favor some slices of this moral pie chart more than others. So the first sort of part of the moral pie chart has to do with like absolutism, and specifically religious absolutism. So, as far as absolutism is concerned, of course, the continual conversation in ethics in order to sort of further refine our senses of morality, in order to further refine our systems of judgment of what makes a good action or what makes a morally just way of living one's life. That has to do with the ongoing conversation between absolutists and relativists. And but for now, we're going to talk about that kind of the absolutist side of the equation. And the first of 4 parts of this moral pie chart comes down to like religious absolutism. Now, religious absolutism is a thing that I would say the rules of conduct and good behavior are static, since the commands of God are to be followed under any and all conditions. So a couple things about this, right? So religious absolutists, it's hard to, I don't operate in that world, man, because I feel like there are some contradictions there. Like, one, we can't just say that all morality comes from this sort of divine command sense of moral judgment processes, right? And this has been like kind of the struggle my entire life as a young atheist, 12, 13 years old when I became an atheist, to now, is like, how do we release the monopoly, the seeming monopoly on morality that religion has? And some of the things I've thought along the way about this religious absolutism, man, is that like, when we talk about God and we say, hey, God is kind, God is just, God is loving, God is generous, God is benevolent, all these are these not like ethical judgments we're placing on God? And if you're going to be absolutist about it, saying that all these commands are to be followed under any and all conditions, it's also a dangerous thing to have any sort of authority that is free from criticism. So, in religion, it demands a sort of like, at least in Christianity, it demands a sort of blind obedience. And, if blind obedience means you can't criticize your authority, which is a dangerous thing to do or to have, right? Any sort of authoritative sense should be criticized and can't be free from criticism, right? But these ethical judgments, like God is loving, God is just, God is benevolent, those things, being loving, benevolent, being kind, they seem to arise out of a non-religious origin. Like they seem to be separate and apart and arise from somewhere else, man. So I don't think that, again, going back to freeing the monopoly of morality from the grip of religion, if we could just simply acknowledge that the very ethical judgments that we place on God, calling him loving, beloved, kind, generous, whatever, those ethical judgments arise out of some other place that has nothing to do with theology. And so the fact that these sort of ethical judgments have an origin that is not that has nothing to do with God or the concept of a God, speaks to a little bit more like, we'll go down the line here to the second part of this moral pie chart, right? But it just seems like that authority, that sort of, these things that we consider all good and just things, being benevolent, kind, they come from somewhere else. And I'm not sure where they come from, but I know that they're not exclusive towards the religious absolutist sort of sense of morality. But if we go down the line, maybe we have a sort of conventionalist argument here, like that conventionalism is a form of like ethical, it's a system of ethics that appeals to a social authority, that society creates a voice of social authority for code of conduct and what is moral, what is not moral. And this, this fits in with materialist philosophy as well, understanding that morality is a social construct that is a derivative of the customs of a particular society at a particular time in history, and also given particular resources and stuff, man. Like, it's kind of like, I and forgive me if I get this custom completely wrong, but like, in areas of the world where water is scarce, maybe the Middle East, it is considered like a sign of respect or something if you spit on your hand and shake another person's hand. And that has to do with the materialist concern of water being scarce more than anything else. And that became a custom, but that custom would not be a custom if it was like presumably in a water-rich area or something. Don't hold me, completely accountable to this, man. I don't know if that's a real custom or what. I'm just saying that something I've heard, and I'm speaking off the cuff here in a non-edited fashion, right? Also, I mean, so here's the deal, right? So these parts of the pie chart, we've talked about like conventionalist absolution, which is the social customs that appeal to a social authority. And then we've talked about religious absolutism. But these pie charts bleed over in a little bit, man. They kind of cover and depend on each other. We see now things like the Catholic Church acquiescing things about gay marriage, right? Formerly deeply held beliefs about how it was against what the Bible says, and we see things like the Pope condoning it at this point or something. I'm not sure if he has or not, but religious leaders, I don't follow them closely, right? But like, we see these sort of we see the sort of conventionalist social authority influencing the religious absolutists of the world, right? They're interdependent on each other. So I don't know that any of them can really, and it only gets like more interdependent as we go down the line, right? So social norms, social authority, you also have like a religious absolutism, but then you also have like a rational absolutism, meaning that any individual could reason themselves into a morally just action. And this was pioneered by like Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant is, without a doubt, one of the most difficult like reads. Like, he's just difficult to understand. And maybe I understand more as we speak to social contracts and conventionalist philosophies, that I tend to maybe understand a little bit more about Kant now. And the cool thing about Kant, like Kant was a devout Christian. He was a pietist. And just so you understand a little bit more about Immanuel Kant, like maybe if I read you the definition of pietism, you can get a better idea of who the guy was, right? So pietism is a movement within the Lutheranism that combines its emphasis on biblical doctrine with the Reformed emphasis on individual piety, or piety, and living a vigorous Christian life. So, so that's who Immanuel Kant was, right? But surprisingly enough, he looked towards, in his time, he was a great thinker because he took ethics and he created a distinction between religious absolutism. He made ethics more fundamental than theology. Instead of deriving his ethical principles from his beliefs about God, he derived his beliefs about God from what he regarded as a purely rational ethical belief. So morals are, according to Kant, they're commands out of reason rather than commands of a divine parent. And this is a really interesting concept to me. Because there is, if we go back to talking about religious absolutism for a second, and having an authority which is immune to criticism, like a god in any sort of theist sort of world order would be, right? Because after all, this conversation is stemming from an existentialist cry for order and the notion, right? So if we go back to religious absolutism, and we let's look at this from kind of a psychoanalytical lens, right? So if we turn on our psychoanalytical lens and we look at religious absolutism, then we understand that it's set up in a command from a parent to a child sort of situation, right? God, the Holy Father, commands you to be moral in X, Y, and Z action, right? But this is like a command from on high, immune from criticism, father-parent sort of relationship situation that it operates in, right? But if you think about a human father and a parent, that child, the first sort of authority it receives is authority from a parent. Okay, but eventually that child grows up to be independent and criticizes that parental authority, right? So if we take that sort of developmental concept of a child growing independent and criticizing their parent, we understand that the father-child relationship of religion infinitely extends the parent-child relationship. There is no growing independent of it. There is no criticizing it. And so for that matter, if we talked about it from a psychoanalytical sense, I mean, it seems like this would be religious absolutism, commands from on high, would be the very, very first and least evolved sense of morality, right? So anyway, it's just an observation. Again, I'm trying not to pick on Christianity or Christians or theists in any way. I'm just trying to evaluate the moral theory from logical standpoints using some of the tools that philosophers have given us over the years, whether it's Freud or Kant or anyway, the point is that when we go back to this third part of the moral pie chart that was founded by Immanuel Kant, it's really remarkable that the guy was a devout pietist and yet created a distinction that morals were commands of reason, that instead of a divine command from on high, right? So that's what Kant calls like the categorical imperative, and he was still an absolutist, right? He said that they're universal and unconditional, applying to all persons in all situations. So if we talk about the moral pie chart bleeding into each other, right? Meaning that conventionalist thought process, appeal to social authority, still has some religious absolutism influence, right? And then if we talked about Kant, though he did try to create a divide, and though he did try to create a distinction between sort of a thought process of rational absolution, Kant's arguments for individual morality, they still actually, it's hard to picture them standing without religious absolutism underneath it, or conventionalist attitudes of an appeal to a social authority underneath it as well. And an argument that I could think of that goes against both religious absolutism and rational absolutism, when Kant talked about the categorical imperative being universal and unconditional and applying to all persons in all situations, man, it's really hard to think of any rule that anyone would want everyone to follow under all circumstances, right? An interesting thing about Kant, though, he thought that, like, as men decided to reason themselves into moral or just actions, right? Reasoning themselves into morality, he really tried to reconcile the individual with the universal, meaning that, like, he said all the reasonings of men should reason down to the same reasonings, which was an interesting sort of way of reconciling the individual to society. And so I so I think that's a really cool. I mean, I feel like I know and understand more about Kant now than I have at any time in the past. But some other things about Kant, he had this argument about, like, we cannot will, like, we couldn't normalize people lying when it was in their best interest, because then the fabric of trust in society would break down. And so, being an absolutist, there is this sort of uh, thought experiment which contradicts or points out a little bit of the absurdity of Kant, saying, like, would you, if you agreed to open the door for a bloodthirsty criminal that surely would kill you, um, do you still open the door, or do you break that promise? And under a Kantian system of ethics, you would be morally obligated to open the door for that criminal who would kill you. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to, like, I mean, anyway, there are going to be these sort of arguments which, I mean, when these principles and systems of ethics are stretched to their outer limits, surely you can find situations which contradict them and prove them, and prove that they seem sort of illogical and irrational. Um, the other thing I'd like to say about the Kantian sort of ethics is that, like, it really, like, it's a really beautiful thing to think that he gave so much credit towards the individual's ability to reason. And I think that sort of, that holds up. But then there's also, like, the other thing about, so we've talked about Kant's arguments kind of being held up by conventionalist notions and religious absolutism. But the fourth part of the pie chart is utilitarianism. And even utilitarians, came in and tried to compromise with Kant in some retorts to his arguments. And they tried to compromise with him, like, somewhere between, like, a utilitarian relativism and a rational absolution area. So maybe Kant, I don't know, man. It's like, you can't kick the scaffolding of conventionalist stuff and religious absolutism out from underneath him, because his arguments will fall apart. But even then, you had utilitarians who came along and tried to sort of compromise with his, because even they took issue to some of the absolutist points of view that Kant had, I suppose. So, well, utilitarianism, man. Utilitarianism is like, it's an interesting thing, man. Utilitarianism, and it's a thought process that says that, like, it doesn't care about the action. So it places all of the emphasis in terms of a moral judgment on the outcome of those actions, right? So utilitarian philosophers like John Stuart Mill, John, his dad was his dad John Mill, I believe his name, or something. Not John Stuart Mill, but James Mill was his name. James Mill kind of founded utilitarian thought with Jeremy Bentham, and then later on, John Stuart Mill came along and wrote an essay called Utilitarianism, and that's where most of this comes from. But he defined happiness as like the only thing that matters. Happiness being pleasure or absence of suffering, right? So he talked about a system of ethics which basically just means whatever results, the only thing that matters is a greater amount of happiness, right? So the greater amount of happiness being the only thing that's taken into account, this works out on paper with a lot of things that you throw at it, man. You might have seen like the trolley, the trolley memes about like the train tracks that forked, and on one train track there's one person tied up to be run over, and on the other side there's 5 people left to be run over, right? And so right now the train is going to go run over those 5 people, but you can go and switch the trolley track and only kill 1 person. And in a utilitarian sense of ethics, this makes sense and checks out. And this is, it gets more absurd as you start changing the variables in this equation. It seems pretty morally straightforward that you would go and switch the trolley so it kills 1 person instead of the 5, right? But the situation grows more morally complex to reason, and points out different kind of interesting things about the logic when you start throwing variables into the trolley track. Like if you say like, okay, well, here's 5 people who are going to die, and the 1 person that's tied up is a person that has a cure for cancer. Do you run over the 5 people anyway, or do you switch the trolley track and kill the guy with cancer because you had to add it? And so there's also the thought process of like, things can be reasoned as a means to happiness. Like you could, in a way, say like, we're going to kill the 5 people on the trolley track because this 1 person that's tied up has a cure for cancer. And though we may take the short-term hit in happiness by losing 5 people instead of 1 person right now, this person is going to cure cancer, and then we will have a lot more resultant happiness from that. So these sort of logical, situations, these thought experiments are vital in kind of testing these sort of moral theories, but also like testing where they stretch out to, but there's also, other types of moral theory, man. While we're on the topic of utilitarianism, right? Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialist moral theories, right? So being a consequentialist means that the rightfulness of actions depends solely on their consequences. And then there's people in the middle, and I would say that's most of us, right? Non-consequentialists, which mean that like the rightness of actions is determined not solely by their consequences, but also something about the intrinsic nature of the action itself should be taken into account when we morally judge these sort of things. And then there are deontological theories, which place every emphasis on the action and do not care about the outcome at all. It's purely about the intrinsic nature of the action which the morality is to be judged from. So, all this being said, man, if we're going to talk about moral theory, right, and each one of us has a certain recipe and formula of how much of each of these 4 parts of the moral pie chart we use in order to make a moral judgment, right? And we oftentimes, as Kant thought the reasonings of all men should come down to the same reasonings, right? It's not that cut and dry, clearly. If you are too much on the religious absolutist end, you probably don't support gay marriage, or you probably don't support a lot of things, right? Because you're like religiously absolutist, right? And then if you're if you are a conventionalist about things and give an unequal amount of weight towards a social authority, then you become this sort of moral relativist that has no anchors. And there are arguments against all of these different types of reasoning, right? Like we've seen before that social reasoning is not first of all, thankfully, it is criticizable, right? We can criticize society, even though our criticisms are sort of diffuse amongst all of us. We're not criticizing any one person. We can criticize society, sure, and that's part of the process of creating a better society. But we've seen plenty of times in history where the general will of the people created an undue suffering for an overlooked, disadvantaged, and marginalized group of, communities. Think about just slavery. At one point, that was the general will of Americans, right? Was that not the general will of the slave-owning founding fathers, man? So that had to be worked out and overturned over time. And so in that sense, man, like a social authority is not without criticism. Even a... the reasonings of mankind, right? Like, so maybe the third part of the pie chart, like, the reasoning, the ability to reason, man's ability to reason, is something that we could criticize all day, because it's just an individual at the end of the day, right? It's just a person that that it's just a person that maybe doesn't. I mean, all people have blind spots, right? So how much can we expect someone to be able to reason within the scope of what they know about the world, right? Within how much they've read, how much education they have, what kind of social situations are they familiar with, what kind of social situations are novel to them, and what is their ability to handle novel situations, you know? So the individual ability to reason is not like an unimpeachable sense. But then again, I mean, even if you go back to religious absolutism, man, like, you know, we talked about people with religion versus people without religion. But how much of the individual ability to reason, is affected by religious absolutism? I mean, we've talked about how we're not immune from the sort of Judeo-Christian moral hegemony which is on the Western world. And we do, whether we like to admit it or not, which is part of like the answer to the feedback of why I talk and think about theology and the concept of a God, is because we can't, we're literally programmed by a lot of that. Our sense of social authority and our sense of individual reason and our sense in a sort of utilitarian sense that we're just trying to figure out what results in the most happiness, all of that leans upon the concept of religious absolutism, or even if there's religious relativism, I would say, but it's unfair to approach philosophy and, the moral theory pie chart, man, without understanding the degree to which theology affects your ability to be a moral person or to morally reason. So a lot of this, though, man, goes back to like, not moral theory, but kind of social contract theory. Like, so we're just going to switch for a second and talk about social contract theory because this tends to go to the root of a lot of this, man. I feel like you can't have this moral theory conversation without talking about three different philosophers who spoke about human nature, the state of nature, the reason for having government, and how much we should obey the government. So think about Thomas Hobbes, man. Thomas Hobbes, he died in 1651, right? Thomas Hobbes was a philosopher. He wrote a book called Leviathan, but it's important to understand Thomas Hobbes to historically sort of seat this person as we describe him. He was in this very exciting time when the age of enlightenment was just popping off, man, and that, I think it's kind of seen that the Enlightenment, the age of enlightenment, is seen to have started up with the publication of Newton's works of physics. And Thomas Hobbes probably read this book, and he started to try to relate human beings to particle physics. I'm not shitting you, man. What he did was he took kind of Newtonian physics and talked about particles and how they interact on a subatomic level, and he likened them to human beings acting purely out of self-interest, and he made that the cornerstone of his philosophical concepts of human nature. So the guy took subatomic particles and the way they bounce around frenetically and try to join with other protons or join with other subatomic particles, right? He made this a cornerstone of what he thought about human nature, and he ruled that human nature is to work out of self-interest. So hang on, let's just sit with that for a second, because that is fucking hilarious to me. Okay, he didn't look at it as like, I mean, if Thomas Hobbes had like I mean, Karl Marx wasn't alive at this time, right? But if Thomas Hobbes had Karl Marx whispering into his ears, he could have been like, well, human beings' natural sort of way of being in the state of nature would be to cooperate and join up with each other and form communes, because look at subatomic particles, because they constantly attract negative and positive pairings, and they're always attracted to other look at organic chemistry with carbon particles joining everywhere. Look at water, its natural status. The natural status of water is communist because it has to join up with two, hydrogen to one oxygen, man. It's just fundamentally fucking stupid to think of. Anyway, so that's Thomas Hobbes, man. But Thomas Hobbes, needless to say, was very pessimistic, man. He had this quote on the state of nature. And by the way, the state of nature is something that philosophers just use to say, what was society right before we invented civilization? What was that like? Well, Thomas Hobbes was like, yo, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Because he thought the status of nature was always at war, that men would always be at war. And we would always be at war because we were driven by self-interest in this brutish and short sort of life. And so his reasoning for requiring a government was because he thought that the government would enforce the social contract, meaning that that human beings couldn't necessarily work out a Craigslist deal on their own. They needed the state to show up with a gun to enforce the contract. I mean, he kind of insists upon that government is the will of government is governed by natural law, and no value is given to the individuals, absolute value is given to the government. And so Thomas Hobbes, man, I feel like Thomas Hobbes would just he was like, I mean, I wonder when I have to look up when Arthur Schopenhauer, a really pessimistic fucking philosopher, but I feel like Thomas Hobbes would have been best of friends with Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is, I don't mean to bring German existentialists into this conversation about social contract theory, but Schopenhauer is the most fucking depressing philosopher you can read. He is a pessimist, a straight up pessimist. And he would later go on to influence Nietzsche, if that tells you anything. But anyway, so Thomas Hobbes, right? Doesn't sound like a fun guy to be around, thinking humans are just driven by self-interest. But around 1632, John Locke was born, and John Locke had a different sort of opinion about human nature. He thought, human nature allows for human beings to be selfish, he said. And he pointed to the invention of money to testify towards the ability for human beings to be selfish. And, as far as, the state of nature, John Locke was like, well, nature is reasonably good and enjoyable, but the property was not secure. But there was also peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation. So, John Locke, man, you might have heard this phrase in, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's because, that's taken from John Locke, but his original thing was life, liberty, and property. So, you can tell John Locke is like a material girl living in a material world, He is concerned with property, man. And, John Locke was an English guy, and he was, he had this radical notion. He felt like government was there. I mean, it was radical for the time. He felt like government was there to serve the people, ensure justice is seen to be done, and preserve and protect the natural rights of citizens. So, John Locke was writing this sort of radical stuff at the time. He lived most of his life on the run from the monarch, man, writing under pseudonyms to not be caught. So John Locke, man, a lot of good, a lot of bad. I mean, a lot of dumb shit too. I mean, it's the property thing. It's just, can we just sit with that and examine how fucking hilarious it is that he's like, yeah, the status of nature before civilization was reasonably good and enjoyable. There was peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation, but the property wasn't secure. I mean, it seems like if we're going to follow a logical dialectic on this, um, is John Locke saying that, you know, there was, what's so wrong with it being reasonably good and enjoyable and, peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation? Does that imply that there's not those things during civilization, but now there is secure property? I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's one sort of anarcho-primitive way of looking at things. The society got fucked up as soon as there was private property. And, maybe we should divest of private property. I don't know. Maybe. Anyway, that's kind of a communist thing, I suppose, right? And the last guy I want to talk to you is this Swiss dude named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Man, and this guy, if we've gone from Hobbes, which thought human beings were bad and driven by self-interest, over to Locke, who was like, yeah, human beings and human nature allows human beings to be selfish. Rousseau is just like the pot-smoking hippie dude, born in 1712, died in 1778. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was just like, he thought human beings were that human beings, according to human nature, were just saints. They were just without virtue, and they were good without effort. I always thought that was really cool, man. Just without virtue and good without effort. His quote on the state of nature was that life in the state of nature was happy and there was equality among men. Jean-Jacques Rousseau also thought that social institutions were responsible for the moral misconduct of human beings. And he thought it was a rather obvious thing to point to, man, since his concept of the state of nature was that men were pure and uncorrupted saints, right? And he also he shared a lot of views about why the government should be around, to serve the general will of the people. The general will is a term that he coined. Jean-Jacques Rousseau coined the general will. He thought the government was around to protect the natural rights of citizens, and he also thought that Hobbes is the only guy over here insisting on blind obedience to the government, giving no value to the individual. Whereas within Lockean and Rousseauian sort of philosophies, man, they believe there's a social contract and that individuals give up certain things, certain freedoms in order to be protected by the state and ensure the general will. But individuals have the right to withdraw from the social contract and even rebel. So Locke and Rousseau have a more kind of liberal way of looking at things. But I would also say, man, that here's the thing, man, when we talk about, and this is why I don't think these conversations about social contracts, right, about why we have a government, you can't really separate them from moral theory. And I think there's a lot to be said on what your outlooks are and where you fall on the political spectrum, depending on what your view is of human nature, whether you think we're inherently selfish, inherently a saint, or inherently driven by self-interest, right? So all these things, man, they go back to, so religious absolutism, big shock here, man. Religious absolutism had its day in the day of the monarchs, right? When there was one person ruling. And then I feel like, if we looked at kind of even Hobbes from being alive when he was all the way to Rousseau, that timeline, right? That has to do with the formations of democracies. And so we went from a governmental system that had a monarch where one person ruled all the way towards where we're in a democracy, which is kind of like, a whole network of co-equals, right? And so religious authority was supplanted by social authority once we spread the authority out equally amongst all the individuals in society, right? So it seems like this top-down need for order that we talked about in the notion also applies towards the concept of religion, and also applies towards, we take those and we transplant our views onto how we feel government should be structured. And if we are fine with worshiping one God and not questioning him, perhaps there's room in there for one authoritarian top-down sort of being okay with that sort of governmental formation. And maybe as we moved on to democracies, we weren't so happy with, a concentrated authority in the form of religious absolutism. We moved on to social authority just as we moved on to a socially governed, country, right? So as our forms of government over time dispersed diffused their authority among individuals and democracies, so then did the moral authorities follow too, right? So that being said, there is this thing which I brought up last time that I feel like, if you are a religious person, or if you are a person who knows what it's like to be religious, I feel like you can maybe agree with me that religious believing in like religious authority, the closer you get to absolutism, the more it kind of sets the stage inside of the mind for other irrational thoughts and other irrational actions and other beliefs which don't reconcile well with reality. And some of these beliefs are innocuous, some of these beliefs are maybe even helpful, but man, like, some of this shit is just absurd. So like I saw an article today. I don't want to bring it up and give you specifics on it because I'd be distracted from talking while I did that. But there was like a drive-through Catholic blessing. Like you could stay in your car, and the priest would bless you through your window with holy water. But in order to maintain social distancing during this time that I'm talking about this, during quarantine, the priest would shoot with a water gun holy water into the car. So I don't know, man. I mean, maybe that's an innocuous thing, right? Maybe that's like, if you want to go get squirted with holy water by a priest while you're driving, or sitting in your car, sure, you do you, boo, right? I mean, but that like kind of, I don't know anyone who is appealing to social authorities, rational authorities, or utilitarian authorities of who would even want to be squirted with a water gun by a priest, unless that sounds like fun and sounds like something that a good like bit of like Facebook Live material. If you're a content creator, I'd totally watch a video getting blessed by a priest in a drive-through thing where he squirted a water gun at me. I would watch that. That would get my view. So just to recap in this show, man, we talked about the notion, and we'll continue to talk about the notion, but we talked about moral theory and how that breaks up into 4 different parts of the moral pie chart, right? And we talked about social contract theory and other forms of like kind of utilitarian thought processes, like they're not necessarily utilitarian thought processes, but we talked about moral theory types of thought processes with like consequentialists and non-consequentialists and deontological thinkers, right? So the last thing I want to leave you with today is, because we had all sorts of arguments, right, against religious absolutism, arguments against rational absolutism, arguments against conventionalist lines of thought. But I want to do this thing on the show where I just got some sound effects, right? So the sound effects I'm going to play right now, this is me making a Molotov cocktail. And I am going to burn down some utilitarian thought processes right now, okay? So here we go. And by the way, these are thoughts. These are not all my thoughts, man, but there is a philosopher known as Robert Nozick. And Robert Nozick, man, I don't know what that guy was smoking, but I think it's fucking hilarious. So here's the thing, right? And I'm going to make this Molotov cocktail, and now... All right. So I'm burning a car behind me is what I'm doing, and that's what I want you to imagine me doing, okay? So here's the thing, man. If our only ethical framework is to increase the overall happiness, that's the only ethical consideration we have. Then there are some conclusions which are less than palatable, we shall say. One, maybe we should just have a bunch of babies. Like, let's say we just fucking start fucking, right? And we just have millions of kids. We turn this planet of like 6 billion people into like 9 billion, 12 billion, 15 billion, right? Why shouldn't we? Wouldn't that increase the overall happiness? Not because babies make people happy, but because bringing a baby into existence versus leaving a person in non-existence, that is ipso facto, more happiness contained within that action, right? So who gives a shit about abstinence or prophylaxis? Let's just have a bunch of kids and the world will be a happier place, right? Oh shit. All right, so maybe that's not a good argument for utilitarianism, right? How about if we actually, Robert Nozick came up with this idea of a utility monster. Like, let's say that there was an entity that derived demonstrably, measurably more pleasure from every single thing that could be done under this ethical framework of utilitarianism. You would be morally obligated to give all of your joy to this utility monster that could just eat all the joy and would derive more joy from it and would, just be a joy-eating monster. So, a couple more things, right? So you got the first argument about let's just have a bunch of babies. Second argument, you got the utility monster. Third argument, right? And this is a really dark fucking thought, man. Addition by subtraction. Why don't we just kill all the people who are not experiencing joy, right? If you're a miserable fuck and you have no hope for experiencing any sort of joy, if we killed you and rid you from this earth, then technically the overall happiness of this planet would go up considerably, right? Wow, that's dark. Holy shit. And the last thing, and this is, I believe, what Robert Nozick calls the repugnant conclusion, is that maybe the world would be better off with just one infinitely happy person. One fucking MDMA, ecstasy-taking, vibrating, clenching his jaw with utter fucking serotonin overload. One infinitely happy person. Anyway, I'm going to put this fire out now. So there you have it. Thanks for listening to No Easy Answers episode 2. I hope you guys are getting a lot out of this. Hope you're getting something. Anyway, but we have just formed a Twitter, a Facebook, an Instagram, and a Gmail. So if you'd like to be a guest on the show, wish to take up issue with me or argue any sort of, if you wish to present a polemic, or if you just want to shoot the shit and be a guest on the show and talk about race, class, and gender, or anything that doesn't have an easy answer to it, let's unpack some things, man. Contact me at noeasyanswerspodcast@gmail. Follow me on social media at noeasyanswerspod. And thank you guys for listening, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I appreciate all the support, and I will get to you next time. Thanks. Bye.